"Don't eat too much, sweetheart. You didn't pay for any of this." My mother-in-law said it quietly, leaning close, while I was reaching for my plate. Just loud enough for the guests at the nearest table to hear. A few of them laughed. The small, uncertain laugh of people who weren't sure if it was a joke but didn't want to be the one who didn't react. I set my fork down. And then the family lawyer, who had been sitting quietly at a table near the back of the room, pushed back his chair and stood up. "My name is Hannah Brooks. I am 32 years old. I am a freelance graphic designer. I work from a small desk in the corner of my apartment, on projects that range from small business branding to publication layouts to the occasional identity redesign for a company that has been using the same logo since 1987, and finally decided to do something about it. The work is irregular in the way freelance work always is. Some months are full and some months require careful management, but it is mine. I built it from nothing, through years of underpaid early contracts and late nights and the slow accumulation of a reputation that clients trusted enough to return to. I grew up in a working-class household where money was a resource that required attention and respect. My parents were not wealthy. They were honest, consistent people who paid their bills on time and taught me, by example rather than lecture, that a person's worth had nothing to do with what they owned. We didn't take vacations. We drove old cars. I wore clothes that had been worn before me, and I did not experience this as deprivation. I experienced it as simply the texture of our life, which was full in the ways that mattered. I met Caleb at a friend's gathering 3 years ago. He was warm and easy to talk to, and he laughed at things I actually found funny, which is rarer than it sounds. He talked about his family with a kind of affectionate distance that made me think he had found his own relationship with them, separate from their definitions, comfortable in his own values. He seemed, in those early months, like someone who had grown up in a particular environment without being entirely shaped by it. His parents were Richard and Diane Calloway. They owned 4 rental properties across 2 towns, and they spoke about this the way other people speak about professional achievements, with the casual confidence of people who have decided that financial success is both a measure of intelligence and a moral position. Richard had the bearing of a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him when he entered. Diane operated more quietly but no less certainly, with the particular skill of someone who had spent decades delivering judgments through pleasantries. From the first dinner I attended at their house, I felt it. Not a single confrontational moment. Nothing I could have named clearly to Caleb afterward without sounding oversensitive. Just the accumulation of small things. The way Diane asked about my work with the tone of someone asking about a phase a person was going through. The way Richard spoke about stability and security in a way that always seemed timed to moments when my career came up in conversation. The raised eyebrow when I drove away in my car at the end of the evening. I told myself it would pass. I told myself that once they knew me, actually knew me, not the assumption they had arrived with, the dynamic would change. 2 years of evidence eventually revised that belief. I was not rich. I did not own property or drive a car that impressed anyone or wear clothes with names on them. I had savings I had built carefully over several years, an emergency fund I was proud of, and a client list that had grown steadily through consistent and professional work. And I had something Richard and Diane Calloway had never once thought to look for. Every contract I had ever signed in connection with this wedding had my name on it. If someone has ever looked at you and decided, before you had finished introducing yourself, that they already knew what you were worth, if you have ever sat in a room and felt the judgment arrive before the conversation, then you already understand the specific weight of those 2 years. It is not dramatic. That is the thing people don't understand about this kind of treatment. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives in small, deniable increments, and it is always reasonable enough, in any individual moment, to dismiss. But it accumulates. It builds a particular pressure that you carry into every room with those people, adjusting yourself slightly before you enter, preparing for the assessment you know is coming. If that is familiar to you, this story belongs to you too. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave your experience in the comments, I read every one. And click hype before we continue. The reception was held in a hall I had personally selected, negotiated, and contracted 14 months earlier. The room was warm and full, round tables with flowers I had chosen, lighting I had approved, a catering setup I had spent 3 separate meetings refining with the venue coordinator. Music moved through the space at a level where you could still hear the person beside you, which had been a specific and deliberate request in the contract. The smell of warm food and fresh flowers mixed with the particular sweetness of a room full of people dressed carefully for an occasion they genuinely wanted to celebrate. I had worked on this wedding the way I work on client projects, methodically, with attention to the details that most people overlook, with a system of documents and records and follow-up communications that ensured nothing was left to assumption. It was how I operated professionally, and it was how I had approached this because it was the most important event of my life and I was not going to leave it to chance. Diane had been involved in the planning in the way that people are involved when they have opinions but not time, offering preferences, approving decisions, occasionally redirecting toward a more expensive option with the confidence of someone who assumes the bill will sort itself out. Richard had written one check midway through the process and had referenced it consistently in subsequent conversations, as though it represented the financial architecture of the entire event. I had written 7 checks. I had my records. The first hour of the reception moved well. Guests arrived, drinks were poured. Caleb and I moved through the room greeting people with the particular managed energy of a couple who had been in constant motion since early morning and were running on something beyond normal fuel. I was happy, genuinely happy, underneath the fatigue and the awareness of Diane's presence at the far side of the room. Then I started noticing the movement. Diane circulating, table to table, with the practiced ease of a woman who had attended enough events to know how to work a room without appearing to work it. I watched her from across the hall between conversations, tracking the pattern. She would lean in, say something low, and then straighten with the small satisfied expression of someone who has just placed something carefully. I overheard the first fragment near the gift table. We paid for everything. She barely contributed. A guest I didn't recognize responded with something I couldn't catch clearly. And then, so she married into comfort, huh? I turned back to the conversation I had been having. My face did not change. My stomach did. I thought about the venue deposit I had wired 11 months ago. The catering contract signed under my name in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The florist invoice I had paid in 2 installments. The lighting company that had my personal email address on file because I had been the one managing every communication. During dinner, Richard stood up for his toast. He was a capable public speaker, the kind of man who had given enough speeches at enough gatherings to know how to hold a room. He spoke about Caleb with warmth and genuine pride. Then he turned to me and said, with a smile that reached most of his face, "We're so happy Caleb found someone practical." The word landed in the room and settled. Several guests smiled. A few exchanged glances. The toast moved on. I raised my glass, smiled, set it back down. Caleb, beside me, put his hand on mine briefly, but he didn't say anything. The evening continued. Photos happened, and I noticed during the family groupings that Diane had a particular sense of who constituted family for the purposes of the camera. I was included in some and redirected to the edge of others, with the gentle physical guidance of someone who had decided where I belonged in the frame before the photographer had even raised the lens. I stood where I was placed. I smiled. I stored all of it. Then came the comment at the dinner table. Diane was speaking to a cluster of guests 3 seats away from me. Her voice lowered but not lowered enough, either by accident or design. I had stopped being certain which. Let's just hope she's here for love and not the lifestyle. A few people laughed. Soft, complicit laughter. I reached for my plate, and Diane leaned toward me and said the second thing. I set the fork back down. The lawyer at the back table stood up. His name was Mr. Gerald Sutton, and he had been the Calloway family's legal advisor for several years. He was also, as of 8 weeks before this wedding, someone I had called with a specific question. I had called him on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting at my desk with the catering contract open on my laptop, and a growing sense that what was happening in the planning process was not incidental. I had asked him plainly, if someone makes false public statements about financial contributions to an event, statements that damage a person's reputation, what are the legal implications? He had answered carefully and thoroughly. He had then asked me some follow-up questions about the specific documentation I had in my possession. After that conversation, he had suggested I ensure all my records were organized and accessible. He had said it without drama, in the measured tone of someone who had been practicing law long enough to recognize a situation before it fully developed. I had thanked him. He had wished me congratulations on the wedding. He had not told me he would be at the reception. I had not known until I saw him seated at the table near the back, early in the evening, working through his dinner with the unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere to be and nothing to prove. I understood when I saw him that he had come because he had decided he should be there. He had watched the entire evening unfold, the circulation, the toasts, the photographs, the whispers that had moved through the room like something released into the air. And when Diane said what she said, clearly enough for the people around me to hear, he set down his napkin, pressed his palms to the table and stood up. Diane had been growing more confident all evening. That is the thing about unchecked behavior, it expands. Give it space and an audience in the absence of consequence, and it becomes bolder with every cycle. By the time the dinner plates were being cleared, she was no longer whispering. She was speaking in the low, caring voice of someone who has convinced themselves that what they are saying is simply true and therefore acceptable. Richard had contributed his own layer. During the period between dinner and dancing, he had circulated with a particular brand of jovial authority, accepting congratulations for the wedding with the ease of a man who had organized it, referencing what we put into this, in a way that was technically vague but contextually clear. Caleb had heard some of it. I knew he had because I had watched him hear it, the slight stillness that came over him, the redirect toward another guest, the careful avoidance of the moment where he would have had to respond. He whispered to me at one point, his voice low and slightly apologetic, "Let's just get through tonight." That sentence hurt more than anything Diane had said all evening. Not because it was cruel, it wasn't, but because it told me, plainly, that the person who was supposed to be beside me had decided that getting through the night mattered more than standing in it. I nodded. I said nothing, but something had clarified in me by that point. I was not going to ask Caleb to be someone he wasn't ready to be, not in that moment. And I was not going to wait for someone else to establish the truth of what had actually happened with this wedding. I reached into the small bag I had kept beside my chair throughout the evening. The folder was there, thin, organized, exactly where I had placed it that morning. I had brought it just in case. Gerald Sutton was already on his feet.
He addressed the room with the calibrated politeness of a man who had no intention of being ignored. "Before the evening continues," he said, "I'd like to ask one question, just for clarification." The music had paused between songs. The timing was, as I would reflect on later, almost cinematic. The room settled into attention the way rooms do when a voice arrives with quiet authority. He looked toward Richard and Diane. "Who exactly paid for this event?" Richard answered immediately, with the ease of someone who had been telling this story all evening. "We did. We covered the costs. It was important to us to give our son a proper celebration." Diane added, "Hannah didn't have the means to contribute significantly. We didn't want that to be an issue." Gerald nodded. Unhurried, he opened the folder he was holding. He began reading from the first document, the venue contract. Name of the contracting party, Hannah Brooks. Payment history, deposit paid by bank transfer from Hannah Brooks, balance paid in 2 installments by Hannah Brooks. Total contribution from the Calloway family to this specific vendor, 0. The room had gone very quiet. He moved to the catering contract, co-signed by Hannah Brooks and the venue coordinator. Primary payment responsibility, Hannah Brooks. The Calloway family contribution to catering, one partial payment representing approximately 22% of the total cost. He moved to the florist invoice, Hannah Brooks. The design company invoice, Hannah Brooks. The lighting contractor, Hannah Brooks, with a note in the contract that she had negotiated a 15% reduction on the original quote through direct discussion with the vendor. With each document, the room became more still. In total, Gerald said, closing the folder, the records indicate that Hannah contributed approximately 63% of the documented wedding costs. The statements made this evening suggesting she contributed little or nothing are not consistent with the documentation. He paused. "I would also note," he said in the same even tone, "that statements of this nature, made publicly and repeatedly about a person's financial conduct, could be considered damaging to their reputation. I want to make sure everyone is aware of that before the evening continues." Richard's expression had moved through several things. Confidence, then recalibration, then the particular stillness of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath his position is not what he thought it was. Diane was looking at the folder. Caleb was looking at me. I stood up from my chair. I was not shaking. I had been waiting for this particular moment for longer than I had realized, and when it arrived with a clarity that felt like stepping into cool air after a room that had been too warm for too long. I didn't need credit, I said. I was never doing this for credit. But I spent 14 months building this wedding, and I paid for most of it, and I am not going to sit quietly while the people in this room are told otherwise. I looked at Diane directly. I have never asked you for anything. I have never taken anything from your family. I married your son because I love him. That has been true from the beginning. And the documents in that folder have been true the whole time too. Diane opened her mouth, closed it. The room was completely silent. Caleb stood up beside me. He put his hand on my back, not as a gesture of apology, but as something more deliberate than that. He turned to his parents and said, quietly but without softening it, "That's enough." The reception continued. The band came back, the drinks were refilled, and the room gradually returned to something resembling the evening it had been before. But the atmosphere had shifted in the way that atmospheres shift when a truth has been stated plainly in a room full of people, not erased, but altered. Everyone present had heard what Gerald read. Everyone had watched Diane's expression when the third contract was placed on the table. Everyone had seen Richard's certainty dissolve. Diane and Richard sat at their table for the remainder of the evening with a subdued quality of people who were acutely aware of being watched. Diane made no further comments to neighboring tables. Richard declined to give another speech. Several guests came to find me before the night ended. A woman I had met only twice before pressed my hand and said she was sorry she had left earlier. An older man who had worked with Richard for years told me, quietly, that he had suspected the story didn't quite add up. A friend of Caleb's who had known his parents for a decade leaned close and said, "I'm glad someone finally said something." Caleb and I sat together at the end of the night, after the guests had gone, and the venue staff were clearing the room. The flowers were still on the tables. The lights were lower. The silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that arrives after something difficult has been moved through rather than around. He said he was sorry he hadn't spoken sooner. He said it plainly, without constructing reasons around it, which I respected more than I would have respected a longer explanation. I told him I understood. I told him that I also needed him to understand that standing beside me couldn't always mean waiting until someone else had already stood up first. He listened. He didn't defend himself. That was the right response. In the weeks after the wedding, there were conversations with Richard and Diane that were long and uncomfortable and necessary. They did not apologize in the direct way that I would have found most useful, but they became quieter, more careful, less quick to position themselves as the architects of our life together. Whether that came from genuine reconsideration or simply from the awareness that I had documentation and a lawyer who would answer my calls, the outcome was a shift in how they operated around me.
I stopped shrinking. That was the most significant change, not in them but in me. I stopped entering their house and adjusting myself in anticipation of their assessment. I stopped measuring my words against the standard of their approval. I had spent 2 years making myself smaller in their presence, believing that the right combination of patience and politeness would eventually earn me a different reception. What actually changed things was being seen accurately in public in front of a room full of people who now knew the truth. I thought about what I had wanted from that family. Not money, I had never wanted their money. Not status. Their version of status had always seemed like something people wore to manage their own uncertainty. What I had wanted, and what I had spent 2 years adjusting myself in hopes of eventually receiving, was simply to be known for what I actually was. Respect is not something you negotiate for. It is not something you earn by making yourself acceptable to people who have already decided not to see you clearly. It is something you stand for. Sometimes loudly. Sometimes with a folder of contracts and a lawyer who stands up at the right moment. They thought I needed their approval to belong in that room. I had paid for the room. If you have ever been judged by someone who had already made up their mind before you had a chance to speak, if you have worked hard and contributed genuinely and still found yourself being described as someone who takes rather than gives, then you know the particular exhaustion of that experience. It is not the loudest kind of unfairness. It moves quietly, through whispers and implications and the subtle repositioning of people in photographs. but it accumulates and it is real, and it is not something you are obligated to absorb in silence. If this story felt familiar, I want to hear yours. Leave it in the comments. Other people sitting in their own version of that situation need to know they are not alone in it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Click hype to help this reach someone who needs it tonight. And if you took something from Hannah's story, if any part of it reminded you that your worth is not determined by whether the right people acknowledge it, tell me in the comments. Your story has power. Every single one. Thank you for being here. I'm reading every word.